Tell me when to roll.
Now roll. Sorry. Okay.
Oh, that one there. That one.
Okay, why is that the GoPro, I think? Ready? Roll camera.
Rolling. Okay, let's go. Oops. Let's get a little further away. Yep.
Okay.
Quick. Okay.
Roll camera.
Rolling.
Action.
See.
Okay, roll camera. Action.
Can you now walk off?
Oh, yeah, about there. That's great.
Might be nice if Kevin now sort of walked off in some direction.
Okay, Kevin. If you now want to start walking across and turn down that way.
We need him looking and then walking.
Oh, sorry. Okay, looking that way.
No, just looking at the machine and then turning away. Rolling.
Okay. Any works, mostly runs across his calculations. Well, yeah, it's carrying mechanisms, not it's all these. So you only have up to 10, not something. You know, obviously the goes down, so one or the other. Yeah. So that goes on. Like when you do have the whole other row, that's the problem is it creates problems. It doesn't do it correctly.
Look a bit more towards me. That's right.
to libertarianism largely by accident, actually, through being a fan of the heavy rock group Rush. One of their albums, called 2112, contained a reference to someone called Ayn Rand. I had no idea who this person was at the time, but the title track of the album was based on one of Rand's novels, Anthem, but with the theme slightly adapted. Probably about 2 or 3 years later, I think sometime in 1982, I actually discovered some books by Ayn Rand in a bookshop in Lincoln, and I sort of remembered the name, so I thought, oh well, I might as well pick up one of these and see what it contains, sort of thing. And I had a bit of a shock, actually, because I think at the time I was sort of a sort of liberal in the sort of modern sense of the term, with sort of socialist leanings. So, but anyway, I think it was the New Left. That's the title of the book. That's the one I tried first, and it sort of seemed sort of fairly reasonable. So it just sort of went on from there, really. And then eventually I discovered the alternative bookshop in Covent Garden, again by accident. Well, sort of part by accident. I mean, I was looking through books on economics and on this sort of thing, and there was a reference to this alternative bookshop. So I found it. Then I sort of eventually discovered all these other people who'd written on similar things.
Can you make sure you keep the volume up?
Not speaking loud enough.
Should we put the mic nearer, or?
No, great deal of little font.
Okay. So, how did your interest in science and the philosophy of science lead you to a libertarian perspective?
Well, I got interested in philosophy of science in the sixth form at school, when I think there was a reference to Karl Popper in one of our knuckle physics A-level texts, and I was sort of interested in some of the more esoteric areas of physics as well, like sort of relativity and quantum mechanics, and a lot of Popper's ideas were sort of go into quite a lot of detail on those particular topics, and his philosophy of science was to a large extent actually sort of derived from the Einsteinian revolution, or the nature of the Einsteinian revolution. I think the main thing which I got from out of Popper's philosophy was the sort of the value of intellectual freedom and criticism. And I think I think the main problem at the time was that I didn't really sort of link that to the idea of economic freedom, and that was just really largely because I hadn't really sort of gone into economics or anything like that. So I was just sort of more or less sort of ignorant of it. Consequently, I just sort of went along with the sort of general, the general spirit of the age, as it were.
Yeah, I mean, Popper's very critical of Marx, isn't he? Were you interested in Marx?
Well, yes, it was. I wasn't. I think I was never really that convinced by Marxism anyway, even though I sort of sympathised with it. I didn't really sort of become that interested in political ideas until really sort of much later, actually. Probably sort of just after I left university in 81.
Do you have a separate question on Popper? I mean, which we'll ask Kevin to just to summarise Popper's view.
Yeah, so
Let's have a separate one.
Yeah, separate ones. Right, okay. So what, in your opinion, are the differences between the scientific method and the way in which we look at human action, society, politics, and economics?
Well, I think I'll start with with pointing out some similarities first, or certainly between Popper's methodology and methodology which you might use in the social sciences and so on. In Popper's conception of science, we start with the problem, and then we come up with a new theory, which we could say is a tentative solution, and then we try to eliminate the errors in that theory, and then we come up with a new problem. So it's a sort of circular sort of thing of you come up with a conjecture, and then you hold that conjecture until it starts to run into difficulties, and then you come up with a new theory, which tries to explain the deficiencies of the old theory, but you never have sort of an absolute truth established. It's always a constant process of trial and error. You can draw an analogy between that and what happens in a market economy, in which you have producers who are faced with the problem of trying to satisfy the needs of the consumer, or to discover new needs which they think might want satisfied. So a sort of new theory would correspond to a new commodity of some sort, and the sign of profitability will be the sign of that you are satisfying the consumers adequately, and falling profits or losses will be a sign that you need to take some corrective action. So you'd either change your business practices or you'd go out of business. I think any society any type of society would face the same sort of problem, in that it's based on some system of production. It's trying to produce things to satisfy people's wants and desires and so on. But I think in societies which are not based heavily on the market, or well, I think in practice almost all societies have some sort of market anyway, but it's just different in degree of regulation of those markets, sort of thing. A society like the Soviet Union, I think the problem there is because the state owns all or most resources. It's because the price system does not operate in a free sense. You have regulated prices. You don't have the same sort of error correction mechanism which you could have in a free or less regulated market. The differences between science and the social sciences, I think I haven't quite really worked this all out really, but I think basically the social sciences are much more complex than the natural sciences, because human beings are more complex. There's different human beings react differently to the same situation, and react differently in different situations, and so on. And it's much more difficult to discern uniformities in the social sciences than in the natural sciences. Although I still think that the sort of general method of conjecture refutations, I think, can still work, but probably most of the work is you don't sort of carry out controlled experiments, for example, or controlled experiments can't tell you as much as they would do in the natural sciences. And most of the work, most of the progress you make, should largely really be based on reasoning about or sort of analysing the sort of logic of events, sort of thing. Trying to find out what one would expect to happen, given that human beings are acting with various ends in mind, and trying to see what effect various social and physical constraints will have on their actions.
Why do you think that materialist affluence is a good thing?
Well, I think basically part of the reason for being here is to try and make one's life more comfortable, and I think material goods are one component of actually making life more satisfying. I don't necessarily think that one's sole aim in life should be to amass as much wealth as one can, but clearly that is a part of life. I see no reason why it's not a good thing, really.
What views on aesthetics and taste and culture have you derived from your study of views of libertarianism?
Well, that's an interesting question. I tend to hold a subjectivist view on aesthetics. I'm not really quite sure what a typical libertarian position is on this. Actually, I think that some of them tend to take an objectivist view on aesthetics. That there's good art and there's bad art, sort of thing. And if you like the bad art, then there's something sort of somehow morally deficient with it. A chief exponent of the objectivist view on aesthetics was Ayn Rand, who thought that you could sort of definitely classify things as good or bad in art, sort of thing, and you could evaluate people's character on the basis of what they actually liked. Now, I think, in actual fact, I think that there is some correlation between the views of libertarians, their political outlook, and the sorts of things which they might like artistically. But I think it's probably a fairly loose correlation, and I'm sure you'll find lots of differences between, in the artistic views of libertarians as you would between the artistic views of any other, or people with different political outlooks. I think one thing where I sort of do sympathise with Rand on this, actually, is that this is speaking from a personal view. I generally, certainly in things like films and plays, I generally prefer plots and things where the good is triumphant and the evil isn't. I'd like to see the heroes. Basically, I like happy endings. That's what I'd say. But obviously, if you were to sort of present me with a list of films or something and ask me which ones I liked, I'm sure that I could probably point to some which didn't have happy endings, which I still enjoyed. So I don't think there's a hard and fast rule on this sort of thing. Whereas I think someone like Ayn Rand would probably think that any type of film or play which had a bad ending or was tragic was somehow deficient. I disagree with that.
The socialists claim to have captured the moral high ground. Would you disagree with this?
Unfortunately, I wouldn't disagree with it. Actually, I think that they have caught the moral high ground. Actually, I think the general impression I get from speaking to people actually is that most people either agree with or sympathise with the ideals of socialism, but then they'll sort of usually say, but unfortunately, because of human nature, it's impractical. So they'll just So in other words, they sort of accept the capitalist system pragmatically. It's there, and it's sort of more or less sort of chugs along sort of thing, and they can sort of more or less get an improving standard of living sort of thing, apart from the occasional sort of recessions and so on. As I think the defenders of capitalism very, very rarely sort of question the moral assumptions behind socialism, and most of the time they also defend capitalism on practical grounds, and reject socialism on practical grounds. Either just simply say, oh, it doesn't work, sort of thing. This is what you get in practice. Look at the Soviet Union and so on. But they don't. There's no real attempt to sort of tackle the sort of the moral issues involved. So I think that the socialists do certainly at the moment hold the moral high ground, and I think this still remains the case even with what's even taking into account what's happening in Eastern Europe and elsewhere.
Okay. Could you describe the music and ideas of the heavy metal band Rush and how these reflect libertarian ideas?
Yeah. Okay. Right. Rush are a Canadian rock group. I think they started playing in the late 60s and released their first album in 1974. They started off being sort of influenced by the sort of traditional heavy rock groups like Led Zeppelin and Deep Purple, and you can hear this influence on their first album, but they fairly quickly established their own definitive style, and have generally sort of tried to. I think they'd sort of. I think if you asked them to describe themselves, they probably wouldn't use the term heavy rock or heavy metal. But they'd probably just call themselves a rock group or something like that, or just a group. Because I think they draw influences from sort of various diverse types of music, and feel that they basically sort of try to do something different on each album they produce, sort of thing. Just try to. They're never really sort of satisfied with what they've done before. They always strive to improve it. The basic sort of ideas which one gets from the lyrics is basically sort of pro. It's just sort of. They're largely right about the freedom of the individual to sort of do what he likes, sort of thing, to do his own thing. They don't like sort of restrictions placed on sort of what they can do. I think their own career sort of illustrates this to some extent. I think in the early days, I think they had a lot of pressure from the record companies to produce more commercial music, and I think they started to get quite a bit of commercial success after the second album. They then produced a third album, which was a bit more artistic, in quotes, and it didn't do particularly well. And the record company they were with at the time just sort of said, well, you ought to sort of try and produce something a bit more commercial than this. And they sort of thought about it a bit and said, well, we'll just do what we want and see what happens, sort of thing. And that's basically been their attitude all along.
Okay, well, there weren't other things. Should we ask anything about Popper? Should we just say, would you summarise Popper's views on science, and also how this led on to his views on politics, Plato and other philosophers, and also how and the importance of this for libertarian outlook?
Yeah, so I'm not sort of. So I'm not really sure that there's although Popper applied um, his ideas in philosophy of science to politics, I don't think there's a sort of necessary connection between that and libertarianism actually. And I think lots of libertarians sort of are interested in Popper, but I think there's something, even if you've not written anything on Marxism and so on, I think his ideas would still be appealing. I'm not quite sure why, sort of thing. But I've often come across people sort of being enthusiastic about Popper, but have not really sort of mentioned anything at all about his views on Marxism.
I mean, you just want to summarise what Popper said. I mean, for the purpose of what you were saying earlier about the scientific method and everything, you just wanted to describe, how he summarised the scientific method. I mean, what he had to say about it.
Well, I did say something about the scientific method actually.
Okay.
When I was comparing the difference between the scientific method and
Sure.
I suppose one thing I could say about the concerning his philosophy of the social sciences was he had this. So I think you can read I think The Poverty of Historicism or The Open Society and Its Enemies. If you look at the sort of positive proposals which Popper comes up with, he looks to be quite an interventionist, in fact. So he doesn't look particularly libertarian at all. He has this idea of piecemeal social engineering, which doesn't sort of sound very libertarian at all. The idea that basically the state can come up with various proposals, and then it should just try out various policies, sort of thing. Then monitor their effects, and then adjust those policies in the light of experience, rather than the same way in which scientific theories are adjusted. But there's no from that sort of approach. There's no sort of necessary connection with. Basically, a socialist could be quite happy with that sort of approach. But I think also he his method, however, I think is a bit more general than that actually, because he says that this piecemeal social engineering approach could also be used in private industry as well. So, a particular company which sort of wants to change its business practices or do something or other, could also apply this piecemeal approach. So,
Sure.
but I'm not quite sure precisely what Popper's own political views are actually. It's a bit. I think he's kind of sort of. I think Brian McGee said that sort of up to about 1979 or something like that, he'd always voted Labour. He didn't say what happened after that, but the other thing that Brian McGee said was that when he was interviewing Popper for the biography of Popper, which Brian McGee wrote, he was asking him questions about the Open Society and its enemies, and he sort of tried to get something out of Popper as to where he stood politically. And the first thing I think that Popper said was that Popper himself was rather surprised at some of the things he'd actually written in the Open Society and its enemies, and he created the impression that he was less of an interventionist now than he was at the time of writing the Open Society and its enemies. But I think then McGee would sort of asked Popper how he would actually describe himself politically. After Popper was reluctant to answer this question, but eventually he sort of said, "Oh, well, I suppose if I really had to define myself politically, I would call myself a liberal, but in the classical sense." this is just a story which Brian McGee told at a Karl Popper conference 2 or 3 years ago.
Okay, should we just talk about the worries about the moral high ground and everything like that earlier on? Should we just talk about, well, how would you undertake a moral defence of capitalism? What, I mean, is it something like that? What moral arguments can be put forward in favour of capitalism?
Okay. Well, let's see. I think, I mean, the sort of, I suppose the one major exception, I suppose, to the lack of moral arguments defending capitalism, I suppose, was Ayn Rand. Her approach was sort of predominantly a moralistic approach. Now, I don't think it's not. It doesn't really matter whether you actually agree with Rand's system of ethics or not. But I think that the important point was that she recognised the need for moral arguments. I think one way, I suppose, of approaching the sort of moral defence of capitalism, I suppose, is by analysing the nature of wealth creation. I think within socialism, the influence of the labour theory of value is, I think that's quite influential, and it has a, I think, wider. It has an acceptance sort of way beyond the sort of narrow ideas of socialism. It's quite generally accepted, I think. People do think that when you're in a sort of working in an office sort of thing, you've got sort of workers, and then you've got sort of managers. People do think that tend to think that the managers are less productive than they are. Yeah. Don't know, I haven't really got a coherent answer to this, really.
Okay. Should we talk about Hayek? You wrote about Hayek, and
I've not actually.
I
I don't think I've written anything about Hayek at all.
what about should we talk about the workings of monopoly, how the market functions with monopolies, cartels, and competition? Should we ask something about that? I mean, referring to your article on the same subject.
Well, what's the question?
Yeah,
I need a sort of definite.
Okay, you might say, many critics of capitalism would argue that the working of the market leads to monopolies and cartels. What is the reality of this? How does the market actually deal with these factors?
Okay then, I suppose if we start with monopolies, there's basically, I suppose you can basically distinguish two types of monopoly. There's sort of monopolies which arise naturally by the voluntary processes of the market, whereby you get to a stage where you just have a sole supplier of a particular commodity, and this is just arisen purely by sort of voluntary market processes. It's not been legally mandated that there only be one sole a sole producer. So that's a market monopoly. And then, but probably most monopolies are actual monopolies which are legally mandated by the governments. I competition is actually legally prohibited. Now, I think what you find actually, I think, is that people, well, firstly, the distinctions usually aren't made between market monopolies and legally mandated monopolies. That's one thing which is often overlooked. Also, people generally assume that if you do have a monopoly, that this is necessarily a bad thing. If there's only one firm in the market producing this particular commodity, it's inevitably a bad thing. Even so they might not like this, even where the monopolistic producer is actually providing a good service. An example of this is the aluminium company of America in the, I think, 30s and 40s, I think, where it was this apparently the sole producer of aluminium, but it didn't actually sort of, it kept its prices actually quite low apparently. But the fact that it was the sole producer meant that antitrust action and so on was brought against it. Now, I think if we still stay with market monopolies for the time being, I think if competition is actually legally allowed, then I think that in itself puts some sort of check on the monopoly, in the sense that if it wants to make higher profits by charging higher prices, it then makes it more economic for the any potential competitor. So the worse the service and the higher the prices it charges, the easier it will be for some other producer to compete with it. So that itself will probably sort of put a check to how high a price you can actually charge. Also, of course, there's also the case that there must be some point at which, if it raises its prices any higher, it will actually suffer declining revenues, because people obviously at some point will just start cutting back on that commodity. And it's I think it's rarely the case that some commodities it can be is absolutely indispensable regardless of price. There's usually some other way of satisfying the need that commodity supplies, and those other ways will tend to become more and more profitable, depending on how badly that monopoly supplies its services. So I think even in the case, in practice, most monopolies I think are legally mandated monopolies, so that competition is actually legally prohibited. Now I think even in those cases, I think there is some sort of check to, or basically the same sort of check would apply there, in terms of the fact that above a certain price, people would consume less of the product. But obviously they have much more power than they would do if there was just a market monopoly where competition could actually emerge at any time. As regards cartels, well, first thing we can say is that they should be allowed. There's nothing. If you believe in free market processes, then obviously that should include the possibility of forming mergers and alliances with other companies. Now, in actual fact, I think that cartels have generally tended to be fairly unstable, actually, or they've had a fairly short life, because again you get the basic ideas of the cartels form, and they think, right, if we all form a cartel, we can charge this, this price sort of thing, and we can sort of keep it high sort of thing, But again, the higher they try to keep the price sort of thing, the more economic it becomes for competitors of the cartel to compete with it, and also the greater the tendency of individual members of the cartel to break away from the cartel. I think in a way, sort of, in trying to, you could see this sort of thing with obviously with OPEC. Okay, I mean that's not quite. You could, well, let's see. I mean, you could. Is that part of the market or not? I suppose you could. I suppose you could regard that as a market, or sort of quasi-market formation, I suppose, on the international scene. What do you find with that? With OPEC? Basically, the OPEC formed in order to try and keep oil prices high, so that it could get more money. But the effect of keeping prices high was to make it more economic for competitors of the cartel to produce oil. So places like the North Sea and so on, and the United States will become, well, they would expand their production, and that would tend to undermine the effects of the cartel. So I mean, what you see now, in fact, is that despite having this OPEC cartel, the price of oil now is lower in real terms than it was before the cartel formed. Now, in actual fact, I think the cartel, the OPEC cartel, was actually became more powerful than it should have done, largely owing to the existence of price controls in the United States, which made didn't allow the U.S. oil industry to adequately compete with the cartel. In fact, I've seen one analysis of this where if I think George Reisman, who wrote this book called The Government Against the Economy, argues in that book that if the Arabs had imposed a total world embargo, they would, due to the fact that supply of oil from elsewhere will be so much more profitable, the sort of Arab oil industry would probably be virtually destroyed, or either that or the cartel will just have dissolved sort of immediately. That's it.
Should we ask something, a general question? Why, in your opinion, is the market a better way of providing goods and services than a state-dictated economy?
Well, let's see. I mean, again, I think I answered that to a certain extent, didn't I?
Yeah.
Earlier, actually.
One about scientific method.
The proper, yeah, okay. I don't know if you want to go into detail on that. Are there any other things? I think like the role of the entrepreneur and things, I don't know whether you wanted to.
Well, I don't know. That's all. I mean, I think that'll do for the time being. I mean, I think. So I might be able to think up some more questions, which you could ask. Maybe I don't know. Maybe if you. I mean, would you be up to filming me again?
Yeah, we want to. Yeah, no, we very much like to, Kevin. I mean, perhaps at your office, or well, I mean, what we were hoping to do this afternoon is if we can all go out, and we'll actually film some things like, film you in various.
I mean, I might be able to come up with some more questions myself, you see, which I can't sort of think of at the moment.
Of course.
When you do these second bits of filming, are we going to be talking during those as well, or is that basically going to be pictures to go with the sound from this?
Probably. I think on the whole it'll be pictures to go with sound. But I mean, if anything comes up which is worth talking about, which we haven't covered yet, then then we can ask more questions. I mean, on the whole, it'll be people like either in the streets or in their offices or whatever. Okay. Well, do we have any more questions we can at the moment?
Well, at the moment, no.
Okay. Well, perhaps we can think now in terms of. I mean, I don't know if we could even go to like the science. The thing is, all that stuff you're talking about science. I don't know if perhaps we could like go into the Science Museum, for instance, which is just up the road here. Filming like going round there.
But you need permission to film.
Do you?
You need
I
permission.
don't know. Well, perhaps we can bring them up and ask if the
Yeah.
photography is allowed in
Yeah.
inside. Otherwise, we can just go outside.
Yeah. That's right.
Might be an idea.
Yeah.
So I'll get on the dog to them.
Yeah.
Anyone wants more tea?